There's nothing like the taste of freshly microwaved coffee. Yep. Tastes like microwave. Hi friends. This is the second video I am filming today. The first video I filmed today was the second video for the Muse Beauty Impressionism palette potential series. That's too many words, Maddie. This is the first look from the video. I decided I was gonna do a second look as well. If you want to know how I got to this magical place, I will link the video up here. I'm pretty sure it should be out by then. I don't know. What's time? No idea. But today's video is gonna be another tag video. I was tagged by the adorable Anki, Makeup by Anki. If you haven't checked out our channel yet, I will leave the link up here. So Anki tagged me in the palette collection tag, which was started by her friend, Angie Ramars. I always butcher her name. I am sorry. And it's just a cute little tag talking about different palettes in your collection that represent certain things to you. And I thought it was adorable, so I want to do that today. And I'm just really looking forward to getting into this one. Again, thank you, Anki, for tagging me in this. That is so sweet of you. And I think that's enough preamble. So if that sounds like fun to you, then please keep on watching. And let's get started. So there are 8 questions in total, and I think we should just get right into it. Question number 1, pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents moi. Sorry, I've been watching a lot of Muppets, and every time Miss Piggy says moi instead of me, it just sends me. An eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents me, in brackets, color story. I definitely wanted to think about these questions beforehand, but the 2 palettes that really popped into my head right away were in fact 2 of my all-time favorite palettes of all time. If you've been here for a while, this is probably no surprise to you, but the first one I thought of was the Arcana palette by Shroud, and the second one I thought of is the Muerte palette by Melt, which is now discontinued, and that is a crime. That is a criminal crime. How dare you, Melt? I've gotten quite a lot of use out of this palette considering it is not the most versatile palette there is, but the tones and the depth and the richness of all of these shades, it's a very special palette to me, and I think it's incredibly unique, and I haven't seen anything quite like it ever. But I think because it is not nearly as versatile as the Arcana palette, I think I'm gonna have to go with this one for number 1 as my final answer, because this color story, I feel like, is everything that I strive to be. I think any palette that represents me will have to have a level of richness in the quality of the pigments, and I think a modicum of depth as well. For me, being, you know, a person who has built a career in the dramatic arts, I feel like it's only fitting to choose a palette that's color story is dramatic and dark and mysterious and moody. Especially in the last few years of my life, I've really wanted to embrace the me that I have wanted to be since I was in high school. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you're an actor, having an alternative aesthetic is usually discouraged because it's less versatile. It makes you less open to other roles. So a lot of my mentors would encourage me to keep myself looking a bit more generic, a bit more commercial. And that never made me feel confident. I spent a lot of years with a bob that was like a dark brown. I refrained from getting any tattoos, which is hilarious now because I am covered in them. I did my best to remain as blank as possible. And to be fair, that never did me any favors in the industry. Even when I eventually caved and got my first tattoo, which then snowballed into 11 other tattoos in the span of 3 years, and I chopped off all my hair again, and I dyed it crazy colors, and I just leaned into what I wanted to be ever since I was 14 years old, listening to Misunderstood by Pink for the first time on my Discman. The feedback that I've gotten since then has been nothing but positive. Even really big casting directors have told me, I like your style, your aesthetic, it's great. Sorry, this ties into like things that are going on in my personal and also my professional life right now. Long story long, if there was a color story that best described me, I think it would have to be something that represented that dark, moody, witchy side of me, which is forever getting stronger. Let's move on. That took way too long to answer. Question number 2, pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents me, in brackets, packaging. That's really cool that there's a distinction between the two, because again, I can understand that like while one palette's color story might be more fitting to you, the packaging of another palette might also represent you, even though the color story wouldn't. And as much as the Arcana palette represents who I am on the inside, I think that the outer packaging doesn't quite do that for me. It's close, but I just feel like the outside would have to have a little bit more embellishment for me to reach for this one again for this particular question. So to that end, I think that the Muerte palette actually is the one that probably best represents me packaging wise. Listen, I own a lot of beautiful palettes. That being said, this might be one of the the most beautiful. It's the art, it's the macabre, it's the romanticism for me. It's just beautiful and a little creepy, and that really speaks to me. Number 3, pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents spring. This is an easy one because we are literally in the middle of a palette potential that just, to me, is screaming spring. And I think above any other palette in my collection, this one just takes the cake. The palette for me that represents spring the best is definitely the Musée Beauty Impressionism palette. Listen, you can't get more spring than Monet. I'm just saying. This color story is so bright and vibrant and yet soft and velvety. And then the shimmers in this palette are like Easter, full on Easter eggs. You cannot tell me that that is not just 100% spring. Absolutely, this one for sure. Number 4, an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents happiness. Ooh, I mean, here's the thing about this question, and I think Anki said this as well, that like the majority of my collection makes me really happy. I think if you're going to collect makeup, you should make sure that anything you buy brings you joy. Otherwise, there's no point in buying it. So if I wanted to be diplomatic, I would say all of my palettes make me happy, or at least the vast majority of them. But I feel like I'm gonna have to go with one that I just recently purchased. And this purchase definitely made me insanely happy. I think the palette that represents happiness for me would have to be Pat McGrath Divine Rose 2. Purely because it's Pat McGrath and this palette is so special. Every time I look at it, every time I open it up, every time I play with it, it's just like, it's a feeling of euphoria. Listen, I don't think it's healthy that makeup makes me feel euphoric, but you gotta get your kicks where you can. I think specifically the thing that makes me the happiest in this palette is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, this multi-chrome. Can we just, not to mention the most stunning topper you've ever laid your eyes on. The other reason why this palette makes me so insanely happy is that it lived up to the hype, which not only makes me happy because it performed so well, but because it was such a relief after I spent over $100 Canadian on this thing. So thank you, Pat McGrath, for allowing me to feel joy again. Number 5, pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents the dark and grungy in me. I feel like I kind of already answered that just because, again, I am trying to embrace that part of me a little bit more. And even though the Arcana palette is very dark, it's very grungy, it's very moody. Same with the Muerte palette. Maybe there's a palette in my collection that could take it a step further. 2 strong frontrunners in this arena are definitely the Antiquity palette by Noctex. Noctex as a brand in general, not just their makeup brand, but their clothing brand as well, is just full on like grunge goth aesthetic. So I feel like this would be a strong contender for it as well. It is a little bit more goth than grunge just because all the shade names are very Victorian England, which isn't exactly grungy, but it is dark. Honestly, you can't get much darker than the plague. But because it is a little bit more Victorian in theme and thus making it a little bit more goth leaning, I feel then I'm going to have to give it to the Shroud and Butte Bean It's Frickin' Bats palette. There's just nothing more spooky and delicious. And of course, Betty Jean is like the grungy queen. That's her favorite color palette to play with. And so I feel like the palette that represents Butte Bean should also represent grunge a little bit. And even though there is a lot of brightness happening in here, you cannot deny that there is just a lot of opportunities to create grungy looks within this palette. Even the metallics in this palette are not super bright, like they're rich and they're pigmented, but they definitely have a darkness to them, as well as these matte shades. And even the brighter mattes in the palette still have a depth to them that brings that grunge factor. Plus, I mean, look at the packaging. Number 6, pick a palette in my collection that represents the girly in me. Ooh. That's another thing that every now and then I love to embrace. Sometimes I just want to be super soft. Is that a crime? And because most of the time I do lean a bit more androgynous, it is really fun to punch up the girly side a bit every now and then. I think the palette I'm going to go with, ooh, it's tough. It's a toss-up. And I couldn't talk about girly palettes without talking about the Creepy Cute palette. Again, by Shroud, they're dominating this tag. First of all, it's pink, it's sparkly, it's got bows on it. Cute is in the name. And then on the inside, you just have all these lovely little pastels. I mean, you have shades that are named Strawberry Milk. So I feel like this needs a mention. And although this palette has elements of ultra femininity. I don't think it is fully representative of that, just because there is still that creepy element to it. So I think if I was gonna pick a palette that is just through and through super soft, I think I would have to pick the Vivid Rose palette by Give Me Glow. I mean, you wanna talk about ultra girly, pink, feminine, sparkly, and this is my personal take on girliness. I feel like girliness could be represented in so many different ways, and it's super subjective, the same way that anything surrounding gender is super duper individual. But I feel like for me personally, this palette just has strong feminine energy. This is turning into a swatch party. I think for me, when I bust out this palette, it just brings out that girly, soft side in me, and it never fails to make me feel like a pretty princess. Number 7, pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents fun. And I feel like Anki said something akin to this as well, but I would hope that most of the palettes in my collection are fun to me to use. The big argument for being a materialistic person is that these objects must bring you some form of joy. And I feel like a large part of joy, of happiness, is having fun. If you're not having fun, then there's really no point. I mean, listen, there are things in your life that you have to do, like taxes. And for me, those are never fun. So not everything has to be fun, but you know what I mean. Anyway, I'm getting way too out of hand. So the palette that represents fun for me. Okay, this is tough. I think the Sweet Shop Cotton Candy palette is definitely a contender. It's definitely the most confectionery palette I own, and there is something very fun and whimsical about that. Wouldn't say it's like my most favorite palette to work with. It's really fun and cute, and I really enjoyed my time with it, but it's not something I reach for. And I don't know if that is a factor into these questions, but I do feel like if I'm choosing palettes out of my collection that represent these things for me, I think a factor for me also has to be that the palettes are the ones that are kind of the top tier in my collection, the ones that I reach for the most. I could also say the Pure X Raw Beauty Christie palette was super fun to play with. I did a pretty big palette potential series on this palette. I will link it up here if you haven't seen it yet. And I remember that series being really, really fun to film and to create around. So I feel like this is a really strong contender. I think also from a design perspective that the two-sided palette design is incredibly fun, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention an old standby for me that has seen a lot of use. If I'm doing something really creative, it's always the palette that I will pull out. And it is also just a staple and has been with me for a long time now. So I have to shout out my Sugar Pill Pro Pan palette. I mean, Sugar Pill is the original fun indie brand. They're just pioneers in this category of fun makeup. They were doing it before anyone else took a stab at it. And I feel like they paved the way for a lot of other indie brands to try fun and exciting things and not be afraid of failure. Look how successful Sugar Pill is now. The entire aesthetic of the brand is bright and fun, almost Lisa Frank-esque in a way. And trust, you can tell that I've had a lot of fun with these shadows. This brand single-handedly made me unafraid of color. And number 8, last question. Pick an eyeshadow palette in my collection that represents inspiration. Because of the person behind this palette, who in and of themselves is just so inspiring, is just such a huge inspiration to me, who made a palette that was steeped heavily in inspiration for themselves. And for me, that palette has to go to At Forest Sight, the ColourPop and Raw Beauty Christie collab. The way that Christie went about creating this, I mean, she was so heavily and deeply inspired by everything around her in nature. The inspiration is so clear in this color story, in these textures, in these tones. There was no doubt when you look at this palette that it had a clear story. And I feel like even though any brand has to get inspiration from somewhere or something, especially if you want that product to speak to people and to then inspire people in return, I think that the thing you create has to come from a place of inspiration. And what better representation of spark than Christie's journey with the creation of this palette, the thing that she's always wanted to do, to collaborate with ColourPop, and then she did it. And she did it in such a way that it was just so representative of her and her inspirations. And that's all the questions. That's all there is. I feel like this little stack of palettes beside me just represents kind of the best of my collection. collection. There's just so much good makeup out there, and I feel like in some ways, especially with indie makeup, it just keeps getting better and better. This is a really fun tag. I really enjoyed answering these questions, so thank you again, Anki, for tagging me in this. I will also leave all of the questions for the tag down below, so if you feel like participating in the tag or just answering in the comments, please do that. All right, I'm gonna head out, but before I do, please let me rattle it off to you really quick. Here are the many ways you can help out my channel. You can give this video a huge thumbs up. You can comment down below what you thought of everything. You can subscribe. We just hit 2,100, so thank you so much. Any and all engagement with this video is super crucial to my success in the algorithm, especially as a small creator. So if you have a few spare seconds of your life, please engage with this video. You can follow me on other social media. I will leave those right there. If you wish to support me financially, I have a Patreon. The link is down below, along with a bunch of petitions to sign and places that you can donate. I do enjoy sitting down and just chatting with you on occasion, so I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. With that, folks, please stay safe, stay sane, wash your hands, wear a mask, stay home if you can. Just keep doing your best, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.